On behalf of the NPS Alumni Association Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to this presentation. My name is Rich Patterson, and I serve as the CEO of the NPS Alumni Association Foundation. Our organization exists for the purpose of supporting research facilities, and the alumni, student, and faculty communities at NPS. Our presentation today will focus on innovation as a strategic imperative, and we're pleased to have Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Snow, Mr. Steve Blank, and retired Navy Captain Jeff Kline on our panel today. Just a couple reminders for today. Please keep your mics on mute. We do recommend you set your screen to speaker view. And if you'd like to offer a question, please send it to us via the chat feature, as we will be monitoring it during the presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce your moderator for today, Colonel Todd Lyons. Todd currently serves as the Vice President for the NPS Alumni Association Foundation and is a volunteer instructor for the Innovation Leadership Program at the Naval Postgraduate School. In these roles, he bridges the divide between industry, academia, and DoD entities to accelerate the responsiveness of NPS to the challenges arising from great power competition and emerging technology. Todd retired last year after 30 years in the Marine Corps and served as the Senior Marine Representative and the Associate Dean of Research at NPS in his final assignment. Todd, over to you.
Rich, thank you so much. It is certainly a pleasure and an honor to be here with such an illustrious panel. I want to jump right in and first of all, call one of our senior members of the innovation ecosystem, Mr. Steve Blank. Steve Blank is an adjunct professor in the Department of Management Science and Engineering at Stanford. He's also a senior innovation fellow at Columbia University. His book, The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, launched the lean startup movement. He created the National Science Foundation I-Core curriculum and co-developed the Hacking for Defense program. It is an honor to invite Steve to open our dialogue on innovation today. Steve?
Thanks for having me, Todd, and thanks to the foundation for inviting me. You know, I'm teaching a new class at Stanford called Technology, Innovation, and Modern War. This is my first national security class, though I have been back involved in the DoD in the last 6 years. I-Core was adopted at the NSA, is now actually larger than the civilian version for innovation inside the IC. But the real surprise in teaching this class was trying to get students, both in policy and technology, to understand the role of emerging technologies that just didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago. The effect of autonomy, AI, cyber, commercial access to space, whole set of things that are now affecting everything the DoD and the Navy does. And that, combined with what's happened in the last, I'd say 5 or 10 years, has kind of changed our posture in the world. I'm going to maybe start with, for most of you, repeating the obvious, and for some of you, maybe a little summary of what's happened to the U.S. and the DoD. In 2018, the National Defense Strategy basically was the great wake-up call, where for 20 years, our military and country was focused on fighting non-nation states like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We kind of woke up and said, well, wait a minute. You know, while we were doing that, our adversaries, China and Russia, and as two near peers, and in some cases peers, and the 3, Iraq, North Korea, and non-nation states, are now the adversaries we need to focus on. So we've gone from, in the 20th century, focusing on the Soviet Union, to the first 2 decades of focusing on non-nation states, to now we have to deal with 5 adversaries. And this National Defense Strategy called out China as the peer competitor to the U.S. As it pursued its kind of plan of global dominance. And at the same time, Russia has kind of reemerged as a continental power in Europe. But more importantly, particularly for the Navy, while we were engaged in countering terrorism, China explicitly developed weapons and operational concepts to target every one of our advantages, both in weapon systems, operational concepts, but equally important in alliances in economic and diplomatic power. And they succeeded. Most of our exquisite systems in space, or more importantly in sea, or in other places, are at risk. What's important for the Navy is that I'm sure those of you who follow this in detail are coming to the conclusion is a majority of our of these weapons that we have, whether they're carriers or specific systems, have now become legacy systems, eating up future budgets and resources. And that's kind of hard if you've been responsible for these systems to be told, well, that's nice, but they no longer matter, or they're going to be in the bottom of the sea in the first 5 minutes. Because the compounding this is rapid innovation in the new technologies I mentioned: cyber, AI, autonomy, access to space, drones, biotech, are no longer being led by our military and government labs. That's also new. It used to be we owned all the exquisite technologies. We had Battlestar Galacticas in space. We owned drones. We owned cyber. We owned the Western Pacific. But now most of this stuff, not all of it, but most of this, and maybe everything but hypersonics, is coming from commercial vendors. And many of those are Chinese. The result is, in the last 75 years, the DoD can no longer predict or control future technology or threats. Finally, the last part is we've built a requirements and acquisition system for the last 60 years, since the McNamara era, that was focused on cost savings and life cycle. And it made sense when we could produce systems that lasted 10, 20, 30 years. And that made sense because we could predict the threats for 10, 20, 30 years. Oops, that's no longer true as well. The result of all this, and Chris Burrows in his book, I'm blanking on the name.
Kill chain, yeah.
The Kill Chain, which should be required reading for all of us, basically said something that took me a while to kind of process, which is we're no longer guaranteed to win the next war. And that's something that hasn't happened in the last 100 years. So that's kind of the state of play as at least I've seen it. And in our class, we've had everybody from Admiral Selby come in and talk to General Raymond, who's head of Space Force, to General Shanahan, who stood up to Jake. We had General Mattis and Ash Carter come in and talk to our students. So we gave them a pretty broad overview of both the changing stage of the U.S. and the world, and also the threats of these new technologies. I have to tell you, though, just in closing, when we talk about innovation, we tend to think of it, and I came into this thinking that it was all about technology, not remembering that sometimes it's just having a great operational concept. And for the Navy, I'm sure we're all dealing with the fact that there's probably a 30-foot statue of some Chinese colonel who said, sir, while we don't have bases in the middle of the Western Pacific, we own more dredging ships than anybody on the planet. And in fact, the new bases in the South China Sea are not built with new technology or new anything. They're not DF-21s or 31s targeting our carriers. They're now built with digging up dirt and putting it in piles and just assuming we wouldn't blink, which obsoleted, probably close to $500 billion of Navy assets, or at least put them under threat. So while we think of innovation as technology, I've now appreciated innovation in policy, innovation in diplomacy, innovation in all the other pieces that make up national power. And that was maybe the other big learning for me, is when we think of national power, at least I came out of it thinking that, well, national power equals military power. But of course, those much smarter understand that national power is what they call DIME, the sum of our diplomatic power, the sum of our information and intelligence, the sum of our military power, and the sum of our economic power. And nations decline when they either lose wars, or their economic power declines, or they have civil strife or concepts, or they miss technology innovation or new operational concepts. And hopefully, both the Navy and the rest of the DoD and the country can figure out what our next move is. But we are in a transition point where we have to think about what our next move is because others have caught up. So that's Todd. That's what I was going to say in the intro. Is
No, that's perfect, Steve. And I want to follow up on that with a quick question. And that is the class that you're talking about, where you had so many voices from senior leaders, but you also had this rising generation of students. What was the greatest insight that you took away from conducting the course?
well, like any great entrepreneur, you asked one question, I'm going to give you two answers. The the, the first one actually for me and the students was, even though the class was focused on the DoD and military and technology, almost every senior military leader we spoke to, 3-star and above, emphasized the need for a bigger State Department and bigger effort in the military. And you go, well, why? Like stamp passports? What's the point? And specifically for the Navy, a number of people, when we had, for example, General Fenzel, the head of J5 and the Joint Staffs, talk to us, said, look, the supply chain and to get stuff to the Western Pacific, it's not going to be there after day one in any conflict. We're going to have to depend on our allies, both existing and new, in the Western Pacific. And then if you start thinking about existing and new, oh, well, that's not the role of the military. Obviously, the military could help figure out what we need. But in fact, the Chinese have been doing a much better job of basing new bases in places. And look what's just in New Guinea, north of Australia this week. And I thought that was a very interesting observation that was understood by almost every senior military leader. The second part, which, and then I'll be done, was the observation of Admiral Selby what a new Navy might look like. Just to replace our, ships and subsurface combatants with drones and autonomous vehicles next week. But he envisages a future which starts with them as wingmen and autonomy. And it's not like we're not going to need carriers, but of course, we might not need as many carriers. And all that being obviously controversial, but I think inevitable. And he also pointed out what that does to our national industrial base. You don't want to mess up the few we have building those exquisite systems. But when you start thinking about smaller unmanned things, it actually gives us the opportunity to do two things. One is to build things that don't last 30 years, that actually make them disposable or recyclable in the last 10 years. And that kind of solves the cost and long tail problem of support and training and whatever. Is no, we don't need 30 years of that. We're going to build them like we used to build stuff in the 1950s. And two is it allows us to create a new industrial base that shipyards that never were building carriers could now maybe build something that's 100 feet or less. And so I thought that was a very interesting view about what the future of the Navy could look like as we go through this transition. And of course, he was astutely pointed out, without, I'm going to put words in his mouth, he didn't exactly say this, but over the dead bodies of the existing incumbents. And so that's the other part of the food fight, is both the incumbents and their congressional supporters are, not surprisingly, it reminds you of the transition between the cavalry and the tanks. The guys who made horse blankets were still lobbying Congress into the 1930s. The problem is we might not have that amount of time. And that was the other take, maybe the third take I got implicitly from those conversations, is that this transition from us owning the Western Pacific as a lake, owning space as our own domains, et cetera, all those have disappeared almost overnight because our adversaries are moving fast with alacrity and urgency. And I'm not sure we've woken up to how urgent this is. So those were the takeaways, and thanks for asking, Kline.
No, that's fantastic. And that's exactly where we want to be in terms of kind of prompting the dialogue. And so thank you very much for that. We're going to switch now to our next speaker, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer J.J. Snow. JJ is the Chief Technology Officer for AFWorks, the Innovation Division of the United States Air Force. She serves as a military representative for the Total Force Innovation and Technology Outreach Again, bridging the gap between government and the private sector, academic, and some of those non-traditional communities. She's also a distinguished graduate of the Naval Postgraduate School, and we are very proud of her for that. JJ, welcome to our discussion.
Oh, Todd, thank you so much. Thanks for the kind invitation. I'm really delighted to be here, and anytime I can contribute to the Naval Postgraduate School, NPS Foundation as an alumni, I'm pleased to do it because, again, I benefited so much from the education I received there as a leader and as an innovator. So thank you for having me today. Gosh, Steve, you set me up perfectly. Thank you for that. I loved it. That was beautiful. So let's talk about innovation as a strategic imperative. Let's talk about AFWorks, where I sit, or any of the innovation models that we have spread out across the government today. Here's what's been coming up lately, and I'm going to talk a bit about the problem, and then I want to talk about some of the solution steps we're taking jointly between AFWorks, AFIT, the Naval Postgraduate School, and Naval X. So the Chinese right now are looking at a strategy that's around technology to become self-reliant. And when I hear this, it really stands out to me because from a game theory perspective, what that means is they want a permanent first mover advantage. So in an area like quantum or artificial intelligence, machine learning, even certain aspects of other emerging technologies like cybersecurity, this is crucial to understand because in many cases, a first mover advantage in something like quantum or AI may be the only mover advantage in that game. And whoever is the first mover in that game dictates the game for everybody else for the foreseeable future or potentially permanently, depending on how advanced that technology is. So when we look at this from a perspective and from the AFWorks perspective, we're constantly looking at the edges and watching what's happening, what risks and opportunities are coming up, and where do we need to plug and play within our ecosystem to make sure we're bringing the right technologies to bear. In this particular case, our biggest concern is having an adversary like China come in with quantum supremacy or supremacy in artificial intelligence, because then they will control specific verticals or specific sectors. And how are you going to catch up? Because your technology is now being beaten by theirs. They're outmaneuvering you. Or to put it differently, from a battlefield perspective, let's take quantum in particular. Quantum computing. In this particular case, I've now got a computer that can break most or all of your encryption. I now have a computer that is able to process 1,000-year problems in seconds. Your strategy, your maneuvering, your positioning, I can see all of that because I'm processing it faster. So I've got that advantage. How about quantum communications? If I bring that into play, now I have unhackable communications. What does that do to my adversary's signals intelligence capabilities? That's going to be a tough nut to crack. How about quantum radar? If I'm looking at your stealth vehicles, your ships, your aircraft, I can see them a ways out. I may even be able to determine the load they're carrying. And based on that trajectory, I can now determine what targets they're going against. And guess what? That makes me much more efficient and effective in my defense of those specific targets. And at the same time, I'm now dominating you in the electronic warfare. In that spectrum, you cannot compete with me. And that gives me a substantial advantage. And so in all of these areas, what AFWorks has been seeking to do alongside of Naval X and NPS and AFIT is figure out how do we help our leaders prepare to thrive in a technology influenced environment. What does that look like? And so that's where the solution comes in. That's where I'm getting really excited because this year, our former director, AFWorks director, Dr. Brian Mao, joined the Chief of Staff of the Air Force's Strategic Studies Group. And one of the conversations we had very early on was looking at these specific areas and how are we going to successfully compete and how are we going to make sure that the United States and our allies are out in front and staying out in front and controlling those key sectors, those important areas to make sure that we're not coming in second place, because we don't want to be in second place. We have to be the ones that are in charge, in power in those positions. So how do we do that? The idea is to develop a series of consortiums. And so alongside of the Naval Postgraduate School, In particular, the Central Coast Tech Bridge, the Emerging Technology Consortium, Chris Manuel, who's the Associate Dean of Research for R&D, the Naval X team and Secretary Gertz, alongside AFWorks. So Dr. Brian Mao with the Strategic Studies Group, myself and Cindy Schur, and then the AFIT team, and now Air Force Research Labs, Rome Labs is also interested. We're looking at this from a government perspective, but we're also excited because NPS, as it always does, leaning forward at the edge, reached out and set up a partnership intermediary agreement with a group called the Academic Venture Accelerator. This group has 34 of the top 40 Ivy League schools nationwide, including 10 of the top quantum schools nationwide. University of Tulsa being one of them. They've already started to coordinate with NPS about what this type of collaboration might look like, and how do we develop a curriculum that's not just a curriculum, but it's an ecosystem. So that as our leaders, mid-level and senior leaders, are moving forward in these spaces and they know they're going to be involved in technology-influenced environments for policy, for regulation, on the battlefield, how can we make sure that they're best prepared? And it can't just be a curriculum, it has to be an ecosystem that's embracing them, where when they need to ask that tough question, they know where to go. They can go to a private sector lab, they can go to a hacker or maker, they can go to a government lab, and they can team up and say, hey, I need you to give me deep expertise on quantum radars or quantum communications, or what's quantum entanglement. I need you to come in and advise me on this problem set. And by the way, I want you to bring hackers and makers with you because I value that diversity of perspective. And we need that. We need people that think differently and that are bringing new, fresh ideas and perspectives into the government so that we can make sure that we're at the edge, we're identifying those risks and opportunities early and taking advantage of them. And Todd, I'm going to stop there because I can talk about this all day. I'm so excited. This is a really, really big deal. But I mean, we're encountering amazing experts like Dr. Joanne Lowe with Elysian Labs. She had worked with Department of Energy before. She came in at SOCOM and was advising us on quantum maneuver warfare. Right. How do special operations engage in quantum maneuver warfare from the atomic level all the way up to dealing with, satellites and aircraft and ground forces? And what does that look like? And from the atomic level on up, where are those opportunities and risks that we need to be aware of? That's the kind of expertise our leaders should have at their fingertips anytime they need it for any of the problems that they're working.
No, JJ, that's fantastic. And so much of what you talk about is that it's not just a technological problem. It's an organizational problem. It's a conceptual problem. It's also a human talent problem. I want to ask though, you've been the innovation leader at AFWorks, as Chief Technology Officer. What's been the most important lesson that you've learned in your journey?
Oh my gosh. First and foremost, bring in outside perspectives. The thing that has made us successful across the board is this collaborative, cross-cultural teaming where we have a diversity of perspective in the room. We have people that are not afraid to think beyond the box. There is no box. They come in the room, they don't look like us, they don't sound like us, they don't talk like us, but they have ideas that we need to hear, because it's really easy to be inside an organization and get sucked into that culture and not even realize the biases that you've adopted. And bringing in those outside perspectives help you to really see through those quickly and to consider things that you haven't discovered or investigated before in interesting ways that really matter when you're dealing with wicked problem sets.
No, thank you so much. JJ, it is now my honor to introduce our third member for the discussion today, Captain Jeff Kline. Captain Kline is a personal friend of mine. He's a retired naval officer with 26 years of service. He's currently the professor of practice in the military operations research at the Naval Postgraduate School Operations Research Department. He's also the director of the newly inaugurated Wayne Hughes Naval Warfare Studies Institute. He also leads the Warfare Innovation Continuum workshop that over the last several years has brought together junior officers and early career engineers from Navy laboratories, academia, and industry to focus on the emerging challenges facing the naval services. Jeff, Welcome to the discussion.
Todd, thank you very much. And to make sure that I stay on time, I'll be referring to my notes frequently because I've got a lot to say. And just like the other two panelists, I want to discipline my comments on that. Let me start with something different. I want to start with a wartime tactical innovation story. And I'm doing this to show you what we want the NPS students to be capable of in the future. Now, it's important to note about this story that I'm going to take you back about 70 years, and that Catalina PBYs were large amphibious search planes. They were designed to operate unarmed. But let's go back to the night of 3 June 1942. Now, this was the eve before the official start of the Battle of Midway. Ensign Dagwood Prost sat in his pilot seat of his large PBY search plane waiting to take off from Midway. He and his crew were about to embark on a night mission that they had never conducted, to employ a weapon they had never used against an enemy that they had never met. On 3 June, the Japanese aircraft carrier group commanded by Admiral Naguma had not been located yet. And so all those famous engagements in the movies we see that were going to occur the following day was still in the future for both the Americans and the Japanese. But the reconnaissance aircraft stationed at Midway had located Admiral Tanaka's transport forces approaching them from the east. The island's defenders were keen on attacking where they could. So Ensign Prost Catalina was number 3 in a flight of 4 radar-equipped PBYs taking off from Midway that night. And they were going to conduct this night torpedo attack that they had never done before. In fact, the idea to strap torpedoes to the wings of these large, slow search aircraft and conduct a night attack had been thought up that afternoon. And the least tired of the crews of BP-44, that's the Air Reconnaissance Squadron, selected to fly the mission. They were briefed, they discussed the tactics, their technicians put the pylons on that had never been pyloned, but they were ready to take action to the enemy, the same enemy that attacked Pearl Harbor only 6 months earlier. Now, led by Lieutenant Red Richards, the flight of these slow PBYs turned torpedo attack planes were airborne at about 9 p.m. and winging toward their target. Now, I've got to quote Gordon Prang here in his book, The Miracle at Midway. The PBOs broke into clear weather just as they neared Tanaka's ships. And although not coordinated, the PBYs made an independent attack runs. Ensign Prost targeted the largest silhouette he could find. He swung in a wide spiral to mask his approach by flying into the moon's path. He lowered this big aircraft to 50 feet altitude and he dropped his torpedo. Now, here's the interesting part, and you'll never see this in the movies. His attack resulted in the first and only American airdrop torpedo hit in the entire Battle of Midway. Ensign Prost's successful attack on the oiler Nagabon Moreau was the first in the entire 4-day battle. Now, you might argue this night attack was a foolhardy, reckless plan best by luck, but I think it was a high-risk venture informed by a sound plan, good tactical knowledge of the aircraft and weapons capabilities, and a motivated aircrew. In fact, Victor Hansen, in his book, The Lessons from the Battle of Midway, observes American commanders were far more open to improvising and risk-taking than their Japanese counterparts. More than just the commanders, though, these were mid-grade and junior officers that combined their technical competency, innovative thought, and bold initiative to do things like strap a torpedo on the wings of a PBY. Well, that brings me to the NPS goal for our officer students. We'd like to combine graduate education with active, relevant research programs so that our students can grow in their academic fields while they also grow in their military professional knowledge. By introducing emerging technologies in a wide variety of classrooms, workshop, labs, and field experimentation programs, we wish to stimulate the operational and technical innovation of these officers needed to employ in future conflicts, just like JJ mentioned. Now, last week, we did commission the Wayne P. Hughes Jr. Naval Warfare Studies Institute, and we're carrying on Captain Hughes's legacy. Mainly, the purpose of that institute is to coordinate NPS interdisciplinary research and education to accelerate and enhance those warfare concepts and development capabilities while preparing our students to employ these emerging technologies in uncertain environments. Now, like Todd mentioned, we adopted 2 major initiatives that already existed on campus. The first one is the annual Warfare Continuum, And the second one was the workshop you mentioned, the Warfare Innovation Continuum workshop. The Warfare Innovation Continuum is in its 13th year. It's an annual event, and each year NPS addresses a major naval issue or theme campus-wide, invites over 300 faculty, students, and sponsors to address that theme in capstone classroom projects, thesis work, workshops, seminars, war games, research projects, etc. The Warfare Innovation Continuum topics usually precede the official Navy's concept development efforts, and therefore the NPS mini projects informs the Naval Service concept development efforts. For example, topics like distributed maritime operations, logistics in contested environments, and leveraging the undersea environment were all WIC topics at least 1 to 2 years ahead of them being official concepts for development. Now, to kick off this Warfare Innovation Continuum is that workshop that Todd mentioned. And yes, it's a 4-day event, and I'm very proud of it. Lila Engelhorn is our major executor for that workshop, but essentially we bring together those early career engineers who've never talked to naval officers or military officers before. We bring in early junior officers together. We give them a scenario. We bring in technologists to brief emerging technologies, just like JJ mentioned, whether that's quantum sensing or whether it's 3D printing. And then they break up into smaller groups, and through through design thinking inspired facilitations, they produce hundreds of ideas on concepts of employment. That later then inspires prototyping, further analysis, and field experimentation throughout the NPS Warfare Innovation Continuum year. Now, these are just 2 major innovation activities that our institute sponsors, but I really maintain that every war game, every thesis, and field experimentation conducted inspires our officer students to search for solutions in very uncertain environments. Now, I started off with a very technical wartime and tactical innovation example. And I argue that NPS prepares our students to be just as technically and operationally informed as those pilots who drop those torpedoes from their PBYs, but in future crisis situations. But I'd like to end on this opinion and echo Steve's comments. We now need to focus on strategic innovation in force structure and policy to maintain our world position. He mentioned all the reasons why, but I'll reinforce a couple. First, we suffer from what business calls escalation of commitment, a harmful dedication to large, expensive, multi-mission legacy platforms. When the robotics age of warfare, just as Steve mentioned, will enable many inexpensive yet lethal systems capable of making our huge investment in the existing force obsolete. Now, this isn't a simple challenge to overcome because our current planning, budgeting, and acquisition processes allow only marginal change at best. For example, every time I hear a Pentagon staffer say, "Where's the requirement for that new technology?" I realize we will always lag those adversaries who instead ask, "What is the opportunity in that technology?" And with JJ's good work and the Naval X and Air Force exchange programs, hopefully we'll start to move toward that opportunity-based approach, which is foundationally different and inspires the strategic, operational, and tactical innovation we hope to catalyze at NPS. And with that, Todd, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, and Jeff, I'm going to invite our other speakers to join in the question, but for you, I would just ask, why now? Why is the Naval Warfare Studies Institute so important at this particular moment in time?
I think it's a marked recognition that our education systems has recognized what both Steve and JJ brought up, and that is the great power competition environment that we have. Our adversaries' ability to quickly emerge and introduce technologies has changed the way in which we're probably going to fight future wars. And because of that, the Naval Warfare Studies Institute recognizes that and starts to move and continue to inspire those cross-disciplinary activities which might help us emerge those technologies. And I'm going to use my bully pulpit here to respond to one more thing that Steve said that I really embrace. And that is, he was quoting someone that said, we may not win the next war. Well, I think even if we do win the next war, we're not going to be able to win the next peace. And the reason why is because our reconstitution capability, both in military forces and economic power, does not rival our current adversary.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And We've got a number of questions that are starting to pop up in the chat, but I want to really start with one that's kind of focused for our students here at Naval Postgraduate School. Each one of you have been deeply involved in driving innovation across the Department of Defense and creating platforms for others to practice their innovation leadership. What's the one thing you would tell a junior officer who's interested in driving innovation in their community? Now, let me start with Steve.
Well, not to be heretical or get anybody court-martialed, but every process and procedure in place is an impediment that strangles innovation in its crib. The DoD, the Navy included, lacks an innovation doctrine. That is, today innovation happens as heroics and point activities rather than an integrated process. We don't differentiate, again, getting Ford class carriers or Virginia class subs through the process than we do a $100,000 innovation process. They have to go through the same paperwork piles, and therefore we kind of keep asking ourselves, gosh, how come commercial vendors don't want to work for the DoD? And usually that's asked by people who've never been a commercial vendor or have done a startup. There's no possible way that the way the system is built that will encourage dual use capability. And so I would ask all of the existing students to think about what kind of systems do we need in place on both requirements, acquisition, and also leadership. And I'll challenge all our listeners as well is, part of the problem is what John Boyd came up with decades ago, and it wasn't the OODA loop. It was the other thing he pointed out is you spend your career either wanting to be a title or you want to do something. And this be versus do is something that someone going through an organization will always be challenged. And in the Navy, it's, do I want to be the captain of a carrier or the admiral in charge of a strike group? Or do I want to beat the shit out of our adversaries in the Western Pacific? They're no longer the same.
Yeah.
Because if you still want to be in charge of a carrier, then you're going to push for carriers, which may not be the correct solution in all cases now. What you should, if you want to do, then you'll be thinking about what's the right thing for the country, the Navy, to kind of win in the next battle if we can't avoid having one. So that's what I would be thinking about.
Boy, I think versus do is, or be versus do is fantastic advice. It actually recalls Anton Meyer's Once an Eagle. So thank you for that. That's all. Had to put that as a plug in anytime we have these kind of discussions. JJ, what about you?
So I've got to say, that really rings true for me. One of the ways I've been successful is I have a lot of friends that are Green Berets, and I came up through Air Force Special Operations. So I think that was beneficial in that when I transitioned over from my intelligence career to innovation, I knew how to do foreign internal defense. And so all I'm doing is technology foreign internal defense. And I'm building networks with non-traditional tribes, private sector partners, public sector partners, and creating an innovation insurgency where we can come together and create our own safe spaces to begin to drive those changes that are necessary inside the culture outward, and then get people that are outside of our culture to come in and inject some of their own ideas and get us thinking differently. It takes time. When you have a culture and the traditions that we all have in our services, it definitely takes time. But I think it's definitely doable because, Naval X in particular has set up this DoD and IC Federal Innovators Salon, which started with 20 people, and it's now, I think at last count, 115. This is all of the services, all of the interagency partners, and these are all of your technology officers, your innovation officers getting together once a month to share best practices, to talk about challenges in a safe space, to talk about leaders that are supporting them and providing them with top cover, to talk about how to navigate barriers to innovation and how to succeed in certain areas and where you're bumping up against barriers that you want to avoid or landmines. That has been tremendously beneficial, and that's just bloomed in the last year. So I'm really hopeful that getting junior officers to think about it from the idea of a benevolent insurgency around innovation will help them to establish a network that can support their goals moving forward and enable them to still be and do at the same time.
Thanks so much, JJ. I think everybody's going to remember foreign internal defense for innovation as the way. Jeff, what do you think? What would be
Yeah,
your
real
advice
quick,
to
and
your
JJ would
officer?
appreciate this. I'm the son of an Air Force colonel and the nephew of an Air Force colonel. And I was a great disappointment when they found out I was going into the Navy. But Todd, here's my point. My father handed me two books. One was Once an Eagle, and the other was Mahan, The Influence of Sea Power. So he said, to be a professional, read. So my first advice is to read, but very close behind that is to write. And what JJ mentioned is quite true. I'm seeing much more junior officers now sitting down to write, to think, and then publish that either on blogs or outside the or in published journals. And that ability to write and think through problems adds to the chorus. And I'm seeing real progress here. It's been a long stroke for talking about force structure changes since 2001, talking about incorporating unmanned systems and small combatants as not an augmenting force, but actually a primary offensive force for the Navy. But if you start reading and soon to be released the Tri-Service Maritime Strategy, in fact, the CNO and the Commandant, and of course, Commandant's leading many of this, and the Commandant of the Coast Guard are mentioning things like augmenting forces, where the second highest priority of the CNO now is naval operational architecture, a project overmatch, which incorporates these unmanned and lightly manned systems in forward hazard environments. All that wouldn't have happened without a lot of people writing and joining the voices. And so I join them and recommend that they do just that.
No, outstanding. Thank you so much, panel. And we have a question out of the chat from Marina Theodotou. She works with Defense Acquisition University and is currently on a rotation with Naval X. And she's thinking about innovation leadership and how there are elements of cultural change and you need centers in the workforce to get the skills they need. But as we cut to the chase on the question, she says, do any of our UARCs, our university affiliated research centers today focus on cultural change as it relates to innovation? And if not, how can we invest in that to focus on innovation as a cultural change initiative to support the numerous technical innovation focused university affiliated research centers? Who would like to take that first?
I'll do it because it'll be real short. Sorry, JJ, and then I'll turn it over to you. So basically, I had no idea for that answer until I suddenly realized is to take what we do at NPS to the UARCs and actually have them start thinking about their technologies and applications of military environments and scenarios and see what they come up with. And essentially have them experience the same thing we do on campus.
Outstanding. JJ?
Yeah, Jeff, I love that. And Marina, hi. I really appreciate this question so much because it's going to take, again, that inside out approach. You can have the UARCs involved, but they have to come in and understand the culture that exists already and how to work within that culture to build out the change that we're asking for. It's not going to happen overnight, but if you can demonstrate clearly why these changes need to happen and it makes sense, then the culture, the organization will begin to adopt them and do that in a very positive fashion. A lot of the times we're trying to drive culture changes without explaining the necessity for them. And of course that gets stuck right away. So having the UARCs teaming up with specific services and organizations, I think would be really beneficial around these discussions. And then always bringing in private sector partners that are doing something that we're getting excited about and seeing which parts, because maybe not all of it will work because we're the government and that's a business in many cases, but which parts make sense and can really help us to accelerate our efforts in these areas. Thanks for that question.
That's fantastic. Steve, anything on that question?
You know, I've been doing this now for the DoD, about for half a decade, not as long as everybody else on this call, but it just dawned on me that after watching multiple versions of this, that we still kind of think of innovation as heroic activities that are separate from the rest of our organization. And the reason why is, well, number one, I've discovered is a majority of the heroes love to be heroes and don't like to think about organization design. you know, those of you who live this understand that military staff organizations are based on Napoleonic, you know, staffs, and where technology was, you know, when we went from smooth barrel to maybe, you know, rifle barrels in 100 years. There's a different organizational design that we're going to need to be thinking about how do you integrate innovation as a integral part of all organizations for what's called Horizon 1 and 2 activities, that is incremental and maybe adjacent stuff, and still keep the, you know, the radical things, the Horizon 3, in kind of outlier labs that eventually move into mainstream. But we're going to need to be thinking about innovation as an integral part of design. And the first symptoms of that, that is the first attempt at that, was when General Raymond just stood up the new staff of Space Force. He has a CTO and a chief operating officer, and oh my gosh, that almost sounds like a commercial firm. Not perfect, but at least kind of broke the mold of, well, we ought to look like how we were organized in 1805. And so longer discussion to be had. So my 2 cents.
Yeah, Stephen, I think, you know, one of the innovations that'll come up is when they announce they've hired a chief design officer. That's when we know that we've made, I think, the breakthrough on organizational architecture. It's now my honor to bring Dr. Peter Denning into the conversation. He teaches the innovation leadership class here at Naval Postgraduate School. I'm lucky enough to have been partnered with him over the last 4+ years. And he wants to ask a question. Peter?
Yeah, I have a question for everybody here. This conversation started out today with framed in the context of the great powers competition. And a lot of the discussion seems to be maybe a background assumption. This is the US as a great power trying to deal with China and Russia mainly. So it's US versus a couple of other great powers. And that seems to be part of the thinking. Maybe I'm misreading it. But what about alliances as a source of power? We have built many alliances over the years. And the last 4 years, we've been busy destroying them. Where does this fit into this strategic innovation plan if we don't think about our alliances?
Thank you so much, Peter.
You know, Peter, I think that's a great point, and I didn't understand how important that was to the Navy until I started understanding about supply chain, particularly in the furthest reaches of the Western Pacific, and that those will only be solved by having alliances, both new and old. And it was really interesting to hear about some of the suggested new ones that also face, you know, problems that China, a resurgent China, is with the gloves off or now kind of taking. So I think I happen to agree with you. I think alliances are incredibly important. I can't mention his name, but hearing I think a 3 or 4 star saying we think the State Department is underfunded by a factor of 10 just blew my mind. Because that was the last person, and it was in their interest of, as I said, not to stamp passport stamps, but to actually solve this problem of how do we use our diplomatic power to extend the reach in the nation. JJ or Jeff?
Yeah, Steve, I've talked with the innovation group at the State Department and actually teamed with them on several projects. And this gets back in part to the diversity perspective, because our strength comes from our allies and then also NATO. And we've been talking with the NATO Innovation Hub. We've been talking with allied innovation hubs and figuring out how can we come together, even the EU, how can we bring everybody together to push back against China, to push back against Russia in a coordinated, concerted fashion, where we're doing things that are interoperable. We're optimizing our participation in exercises. We're collaborating on technology solutions, and we're coming together to grant a competitive advantage for everybody that's involved as that part and parcel of that agreement. And I think this is this is part of a much bigger discussion where the State Department gets involved and begins reaching out to a lot of the diplomatic groups, a lot of the military groups, and we figure out how do we start to mesh our teams in a meaningful way that we can push back, be competitive, but also focus on, that 80% upfront where we're stabilizing areas, we're leveraging diplomacy and economic incentives, and we don't have to get to the military and the intelligence pieces until it's actually that 20% where we're heading into conflict. How do we get our leaders to really think about layering technology in such a way that it grants an advantage, that it forces our adversaries to come to the table and it forces diplomacy to happen, so that we're not butting up against conflict and we're not butting up against crisis immediately. We've got some built-in leeway there to maneuver because we've been thoughtful as partners, as allies, in building what's coming next. And so I think this is such an important discussion. And I do agree that the State Department has a big role to play, but we've got to get them funded appropriately so that they can engage in the areas that they need to engage in. They just aren't right now. They want to, they've got some great ideas because I've heard them, but we need to do more to support those efforts here and abroad.
Outstanding. Jeff?
Yeah, I would like to follow up on that. So some of the ways in which we engage potential allies is exactly, I think we don't leverage NPS enough through education, through seminars, through war games, particularly war games for our closest allies, because then we have an exchange of ideas of actually how to operate and what they feel is important. I've got some personal experience in this, but instead I'd like to highlight again our Warfare Innovation Continuing Workshops executor, Lila Engelhorn, who took that workshop to Australia. And that's now part of their regular planning process within their budgeting system for their forces. That's one answer. So one of the ways in which we can do that is through education engagement, seminar engagement, and wargame engagement. I think that's going to be critical. Of course, we do that hand in hand with the State Department itself. But I'm also a strategic realist. What I mean by that is if we perceive ourselves, in fact, we have eroding our influence around the world, our potential allies also will see that erosion of power. And they will align themselves to China if that is in their best interest. And so at this time, we have to show both the strength and the capability to be able to ensure that we protect them and the commitment that we protect them in the case the things gets hairy. And right now, I'm not sure we fully do that in the gray zone activities. So we have to be careful about that and think hard and long about exactly what we show and how we show our allies to our commitment to their region.
You know, I love that idea of innovation as a way of creating decision space. That is a tremendous insight. So thank you for that, panel. I now want to turn to a question from Sinker Wu. Sinker is an alum of NPS. He's also works with Raytheon Technologies. His question is, with respect to the first mover advantage and intellectual property, what are your thoughts on creating an ecosystem for innovation where there is a constructive competition among U.S. academia, government, and industry, but the context is that our near-peer adversaries seem to take advantage of IP, intellectual property, and innovation contrary to our own standards of conduct? Who'd like to jump in on that? That's a great question, Sinker. Thank you.
Well, you know, in the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. kind of put together the military, industrial, and academic alliance that kind of started in World War II with OSR&D, Office of Science Research and Development, and also led post-World War II by NRL. In fact, NRL and ONR were the first people to fund innovation at Stanford in 1946, when ONR first got stood up in August of that year. Every research university in the United States during the Cold War actually worked on DoD and military problems on campus. That ended with the Vietnam War, and not only did ROTC get thrown off of campus, but so did classified research at most universities. And I think your reference, Todd, and the reference to the person who asked the question is that China simply looked at what we did in the 50s and 60s and has done what's called civilian military fusion, which And now every commercial company, startup to large corporation, needs Communist Party representation inside their corporations. And so they're doing this in spades. We didn't require the Democratic or Republican Party to be in our companies in the 50s and 60s. We did this out of national interest. I think that, part of the problem, and there are multiple answers to this, is for 50 years, the word national industrial policy has been a third rail for the US. National industrial military policy has been a third rail. National service has been a third rail. The problem is we've run these science experiments and we've been afraid to say, well, what's happened since we've disconnected the body populace from any skin in the game. Our attempt at starting hacking for defense, and you've run a great program here at NPS, was just our small attempt to kind of do that, to get some students and industry kind of engaged. Dan Finkelstadt running the H4D program at NPS. So that's a long answer to say we got a long way to go. I think if we could articulate the reason why, I've been surprised how many people are willing to stand up and get engaged in both companies and as individuals. And we just seem to be listening to the people with the loudest voices. Those aren't the people who actually speak for the majority. So I've found.
Thank you so much, Steve. JJ?
Yeah, this is another one of those awesome questions that we could probably go on for weeks about.
And I did, so I apologize.
No, not at all. I love it. I love it. And Steve, I bet this is amazing in your course too, because it's so intricate and there's so many complexities. But the advent of all of these innovation hubs that are nationwide, one of the things that we haven't done well until recently is to connect them in a meaningful way so that we are cross-collaborating, we're creating those creative collisions between services, between agencies, between allied partners and NATO partners in a way that everybody's benefiting. And providing these spaces that are outside of guards, gates, and guns, so anybody can walk in. They're not limited by having to badge in and check in and get an escort. They can just walk in with an idea and be part of a hackathon, be part of a challenge, be part of a problem solving, be part of a discussion, and have that impact right away and see like they're getting immediate feedback on what they're providing as being useful to a government problem. And then the other piece I think that's really important is we have so many amazing minds, like bright minds that are in this country, that are in our military, that are immigrating to our country right now. And I gotta say, we need to open the aperture on how to get these people into these safe spaces, to have the messy discussions, to get the different diversity of perspective involved and fund their ideas. Let's do, and you'll hear Secretary Gertz say this all the time, lots of small bets. Let's make lots of small bets across the board because several of those will pay off in a big way down the road. And I think that's something that we need to do more of. So that's my thought on this. And this is, this is something that could be an entirely separate panel or a whole course.
No, absolutely. And I was going to ask our panelists, we're rapidly closing on time, but we have a few more questions. Are you able to stay with us for a few more minutes?
Certainly.
Awesome. Fantastic. Jeff, did you want to answer that last question?
I just want to write on top of what JJ said, quoting Secretary Gertz, that was a very venture capitalist type approach, right? Make a lot of small bets, a lot of areas, and see what, and that's the difference when I was talking about before between opportunity-based acquisition and requirements-based acquisition. And we've got to start thinking that way. And we have to involve the hubs that exist now between industry and academia and the government in order to start leveraging that.
I want to double down with what Jeff just said. It's very hard to kind of to talk to requirements people about outcomes, and I think that's a different mindset that's going to have to get both written into acquisition policy, because we now know things change as you start building things, outcome-based requirements are certainly different than feature-based requirements. So I just wanted to point that out, that is a critical requirement.
No, fantastic, Steve. And Bradley Goodrich asked the question, what areas of technology would you initially pursue to leverage private capital funding? What is the best way to communicate the role of private capital to DoD leadership? And if I'm going to broaden this question out, I think what he's highlighting is the huge gap between the venture capital community, the DoD community, and I would even say the non-traditional defense industry, and perhaps even a company that doesn't think of themselves as being a defense industry company. They're just a company and they're not part of that industrial base. But I apologize, Bradley, if I've broadened your question out, but what do you think? Who wants to?
So Todd, let me start, if I can, with some two very specific things everybody in this call should know about. In the lack of anything the DoD was doing, we started something called the Defense Investors Network in Silicon Valley. There's now 75 or 100 venture capitalists who do dual use investing, meet every month virtually, have had almost every service and defense agency, and the most underrepresented group has been the Navy. And what I mean by that is speakers come in and say, hey, we need X or Y, or you guys got any companies doing X or Y, or here are the needs, boom. The second part is, this is JJ's expertise, but I've worked with a bunch of, the DoD has about 75 different accelerators going on. At the end of the day, I can't think of any that are a program of record that have come out of their systems. And so I call this great innovation theater, and I don't mean to demean the progress. It's shaping culture, it's pointing awareness. But if you look at the 88 MDAPs, the 88 major defense acquisition programs, they're all legacy systems in one way or another. And until we figure out how to get leadership to stop doing the innovation head nod and start writing the checks to the things that are coming out of JJ's accelerators and the other 75 of them, then we're going to constantly fall behind. And I think that's a real problem. And it's going to take Congress, and it's going to take, I think all of this may be another Goldwater-Nichols Act to kind of reconstitute the military to deal with innovation at speed and urgency that it really deserves.
Wow, that was fantastic. Thanks, Steve. JJ?
So much I want to say. Yes, and yes. Transitioning projects from a lot of these initiatives to a program of record is hard. Has it been done? Yes. Is it done consistently? No. When we were at SoftWorks, my last year there, 2019, we had 12 transitions to program of record. I think it's really important to highlight when that happens, because typically you have a customer that is shepherding that project from phase 2 through the valley of death to an actual program of record with the assistance of a program executive office. That doesn't always happen. But if you can't get a network set up where you've got an innovation hub that's then bringing in a customer. So what we typically do with AFWorks in particular is we'll get a government customer for a SBIRS or a SITRS up front. That then turns into a phase 2. So they get their next round of funding and they get to work with that customer, shaping the technology or that solution to meet their need, with the end goal being that we're now going to transition this to a program of record or to a longer term contract. But the other thing that we've been doing, which I really like a lot, is we've been taking it through private sector investors and other companies so that they're getting a commercial stream and they're also getting that public sector stream. So the public sector money might flow in from SBIRS, SITRS, or a longer term funds, longer term contracts through like a proof of concept. The money coming from the commercial side, I like to see this dual use path happening because it forces the company to stay competitive. They don't get stale. They're not locked into a legacy contract. It isn't a specific statement of work that you have to constantly mod to get any kind of change. It forces them to stay competitive or get replaced by another company. So this is something that we've been really keen to adapt, and we've been continuing to use this in the time that I've been there. And I think it's a successful path forward. But to Steve's point, unless and until we make this part of the acquisition pathway, and we keep bumping up against legal, and there's a lot of friction on how do you interpret the FAR and what can you and can't you do. And I've seen some people that are amazing with the FAR. Jonathan Mostowski, who was with the, oh my gosh, Rebellion Defense now, but he was with the cyber team at the Pentagon. I'm forgetting their name right now. He was one of the founders there. He knows the FAR inside and out. And so he knows what can and can't be done. And what he's done with it has been brilliant, because he optimizes for flexibility and contracting when he was in the government. And now that he's outside of the government, he's leveraging it on behalf of speed to solution, and speed to solution where we need it most, where it matters most for our warfighters. That's so important. And getting those adjacent, those parallel innovation opportunities set up that government customers can dip into, so it's not a threat to their current program. So suddenly the young folks are dipping in there going, oh, this is really cool. Hey, I saved 4 hours today because I don't have to go on 3 different systems. Oh, and then everybody else like, how'd you do that? Oh, well, maybe we want this too. That's how you get them to do transformation, and you get away from the incremental, but you have to set it up that way so that it's not a threat. It's a, hey, we really value your expertise in this area. You guys are amazing and you're the best at what you do. Can you check this out and tell us where it's broken, where it works, where it doesn't work? Because now it's not a threat. You're asking for advice. And so all of these things need to come together in a meaningful way. And I'll just cap that with metrics. If we're not doing the metrics correctly, we're not measuring the progress correctly. And until we get that part right, I think we're going to continue to struggle with this across the board.
No, thanks, JJ. Jeff?
Well, was the original question about which technologies to invest in?
Dadgummit, you remember the original question? Yes.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back to JJ's comments on that one. And, I think like a military planner, so in a way, and I prioritize, we got to think about the things we can't lose. And that's what we need to prioritize first. Quantum comes to mind naturally. We might be able to be a second adapter to 5G and survive. It just means that we lie to ourselves faster. That's Jeff Kline's cynical comment, right? But there's some things we cannot get and we can't fall behind on if we're going to maintain a competitive space. And those are the things we need to prioritize and realize and invest heavily in that. And if we have to, go back to Congress and say we need to revisit that law, and maybe we need to visit the spirit of the Constitution as far as discretionary funds and how we can use them. We've done that many times in crisis points. We've given discretionary funds in every war to be able to freely invest where we need to and acquire what we need to acquire. I personally think right now we are at that crisis point.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Jeff. Steve and JJ, I want to go back and ask, if you could, what's the 1 or 2 technology areas where you would say, dadgummit, new Secretary of Defense, this is where we ought to put a good chunk of our skin in the game in innovation? What technology area would it be? Steve?
Oh, I knew I was going to get called. I see everybody else looking in the air. Actually, I would change the question. I guess I wouldn't, we don't have enough budget to pick all of them. I would be asking, what are the new operational concepts we need to have to leapfrog our competitors? And then think about what technologies are needed to kind of deploy that in conjunction with all the other things we mentioned. It might be a technology, but as I said, the islands in the South China Sea weren't built with technology. It might be quantum, it might be something else, but what is it we want to achieve and how do we get ahead, not just catch up? And those come down to like uncomfortable questions. Do we still want to be able to defend Taiwan? Do we still want, what is our strategy now, which are, the Marine Corps has a new strategy, but it assumes that we want to accomplish a certain set of things. What are those set of things we want to accomplish, and how is it we want to do that in a way that we win? And the technology will fall out of that. And much smarter people on this call will be responsible for figuring that out.
No, great. Thank you, Steve. JJ?
So, I'm going to go back to the quantum and the AI. For me, those all paths lead back there. It doesn't matter if you're doing business. It doesn't matter if you're in manufacturing. It doesn't matter if you're analyzing large amounts of data. In every case, having an advantage in one or both of those is going to grant an advantage across multiple spaces. So I think we really need to closely consider our investments in that space, and let's not go it alone. I mean, there's some incredible, incredible projects happening in the UK right now, in the Netherlands, in Germany right now. Let's start to talk to our partners about how we can team up around these spaces and come to a solution that all of us agree on. I'm talking about let's do the next Asilomar, but for AI or for quantum, and get people together in those spaces. That's what's going to make the difference. That's where I would love to see the discussion start to go, because with great power comes great responsibility. And if we're not the ones in power, that could be a problem in the future. And I want to make sure that these technologies are appropriately, responsibly deployed and managed for good, not for evil.
Yeah. Now, and panelists, I just want to say thank you so much for an absolutely fantastic conversation this afternoon. I've certainly taken away a number of points. Innovation as part of the decision space for our decision makers. Innovation is required in diplomacy as much as it is in technology. The requirement to have a diversity of perspectives, and ultimately, to build on what JJ was just saying, to build a sense of community, not just in our services, in our military, in our broader defense industrial establishment, but really with all of those partners and allies, because together we're stronger. And I think that's a great way to end the conversation. And with that, Rich, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks very much, Todd. Appreciate it. And thank you to Lieutenant Colonel Snow, Steve Blank, and Jeff Kline for their time today. Really appreciate the opportunity to hear your thoughts and bring you all together. And thanks again to our moderator, Colonel Lyons, for his time as well. I want to thank all the audience for joining us. We look forward to continuing these programs in January in partnership with the Naval Postgraduate School and our foundation. Please look to our newsletter for updates, as well as our social media, and also keep an eye on the NPS website. Until then, we wish you and your families a Merry Christmas, Happy Holiday Season, and hope the new year brings you good health and happiness. Signing off for now. Thanks, everyone.
Merry Christmas. Thanks to all of our presenters.
Happy holidays, everybody.